Crespo is going to be host for Let's Talk Football, the round table. And Let's Talk Football ladies.
Hello, everybody, and Let's Talk Football. Delilah Crespo here with another episode of Diversity with Delilah. Today, I bring you Gene Mingo, considered the first Black kicker in pro football. The reason I say pro football is that there have been some episodes where I talk about players being part of previous leagues, right? There were various leagues that kind of came and went, or before the most recent one was the American Football League, which then, as many of you know, became part of the NFL, and they both became together the National Football League that we know today. It's why we have the national, the NFC and the AFC now, because of it, because of the merger. But anyway, I digress. So, Gene Mingo, born and raised in Akron, Ohio. He plays several positions: halfback, place kicker, and return specialist, but it's his place as the first Black place kicker in pro football that he gets a lot of recognition for. So, how did it start? He was among the few who were at the very beginning of the American Football League. He also was one of the few players with no college experience at all that made it to pro football. But how did he get there? He didn't go to college, but played on a service team while he was in the United States Navy. He says, playing in a service, when you go against the Marines, Army, or even another Army team, it was like almost playing against the Raiders or Chiefs, Mingo says. The reason he says this is that a lot of well-known NFL players, which I've actually talked about a few NFL players that enlisted, right, and then went and played pro football. And so a lot of college guys that would wind up in the National Football League or American Football League or any of that, they did play in the service. They played on these service teams. And so people are saying that was actually a really good training ground for players. And so even though he didn't have collegiate experience like so many others, the fact that he played on a Navy team and played against all these tough guys that would later go on to the NFL anyway, or do really good things in college, that it still gave him the preparation he needed. So it wasn't like something against him that he didn't play in college. Okay, so a little bit about Gene and his cousin Dean. Sorry that rhymed. Anyway, there's a reason why I'm starting them, because this is the beginning of his story and how he got into football. In the summer of 51, before he turned 13, he spent that summer hanging out with his cousin Dean, who he loved. His name was Dean Newby. They were inseparable, right? As 13-year-old boys are in the summer, or any 13-year-old kids, right? You running around, going everywhere. Gene really looked up to him. Gene thought that Dean, his cousin, was better looking, faster, smarter, tougher, and he wanted to be like Dean. Dean played football for the Akron, Ohio junior Bantam team, the Hornets. Before long, he convinced Gene to join him. And after the first week or so, it was fine. Gene says he was proud to wear the uniform, proud to play with his cousin. But the coach called for scrimmage. Gene went in for that. He got hit right in the mouth. He tasted his own blood, and he's like, nope, the game's too tough, and he quit that day. Well, his cousin Dean was super mad, called Gene a quitter, tried to get his cousin back on the team. There was an unfortunate tragedy a week later where Dean lost his life after being mauled by a dog. Gene was distraught that his cousin Dean, don't get them confused, I know, going back and forth. It was Dean who he looked up to, sadly mauled by a dog and passed away from his injuries. Gene, distraught, crying, depressed, sad, went to his aunt and tried to console her because he saw her crying in the kitchen and breaking down, over her baby. And so Gene told him, I can be your baby. And he says, this is coming from him because these are excerpts from an interview that he did. So I got some excerpts from some interviews. And he said that through her tears, she looked at him and said, "You can't be my baby because you're a quitter," right? And he said that just stuck with him, right? And so he decided he would never quit football again, right? Football, life, different thing, but football, he wasn't going to quit. So he went back to the junior bantams. He asked if he could wear the number 13 because that was the number his cousin Dean wore. Gene wasn't into school. He skipped a lot. He was barely there. He just didn't like school. He played on the team, but he didn't like school. So he skipped a lot. At 13, Gene's mother had a series of health issues where she suffered from all of these strokes. So she needed round-the-clock care. One day, his dad got a phone call about Gene skipping school. And so his dad is like, listen, you obviously don't like school. Your brothers and sisters are going to school. Give them a chance to graduate and finish and go on to do things. Why don't you just stay home and take care of your mother? So he says, fine, right? So he's like, whatever. So he drops out of high school and decides he's going to stay home and take care of his mother and let his siblings kind of go to school and get their stuff going. Gene did take care of his mom for 3 years. She passed away in 1954 at the age of 50. But he did promise his mom that he'd go back to school and graduate. So Gene went back. He was older than a lot of kids already because he missed years of school, right? So he was older, he was bigger, he was stronger. He was the star of the football team because he was a bigger guy, but not in the classroom. And, because he missed all that school staying. First of all, he was always skipping, but then he spent 3 years taking care of his mother. So he missed a lot of school. One day, a teacher really insulted him, made him feel dumb. So he jumped up and ran out. He's like, forget it. I'm not going to stay here and, learn from some white guy, So he just leaves. But he joined the Navy. Okay. So he didn't just, he dropped out of high school, but he did join the Navy. He went back to playing football. This is where he got onto the Navy team, where he got his football experience, older and more seasoned, right? Not high school. So back then, the Navy bases had football teams, and Gene was a star as a running back, defensive back, and field goal kicker. So that's where he starts getting some of that field goal, that kicker experience. He says he was big stuff on the base because he was doing so well that he would just show up. Didn't even have to show his ID, his big man on campus. 3 years after that, he got discharged from the Navy, completed his time, went back to Akron, got a job at Goodyear. So that's kind of where he went to work. Then in 1960, while I was reading a newspaper, he read that the American Football League was being formed and that there was a player out of Fort Carson Army Base that had signed with the Broncos. And to Gene's thinking, again, not me, okay, you military people out there, how military branches can be competitive against each other. So he figured that if an Army player could make the Denver Broncos team make a football team, so could he. So he wrote a letter to the Broncos general manager at that time, Dean Griffin. He spent a long time on it. He had his older sister help him put the letter together because remember, he didn't have a lot of schooling. He was a high school dropout, so he wanted to make sure that this letter was well written and made sense because he was trying to convince someone, give him a job on a football team. So he sent the letter to the Denver Broncos. He waited. The AFL was in direct competition, right, with the NFL for players. So they always double dip. That's why sometimes when they talk about some of these diversity with Delilah players, you will see that they'll get drafted by both leagues, right? And then the player needs to decide, which league he wants to play for. So anyway, so the AFL was in direct competition. They were all dipping in the same pool. The AFL teams were desperate to sign anyone with experience. Griffin actually responded to Gene personally. He sent him a contract for $6,500. Remember, this is 1960, so it's a lot of money. He signed it, but it wasn't just signing. You actually had to go and earn it. So to earn that $6,500, he had to make the team, right? So yes, they'll give you a contract, but it didn't mean you would actually wind up getting paid that. You actually had to compete for a spot on the team. So he went out there. He was one of 100 players that reported to a training camp. Gene was laughing, running plays with some, with some friends, some hopefuls on the team, while Broncos head coach at the time, Frank Filchak, evaluated the team's kicking prospects. Coach Filchak didn't like what he was seeing from the guys competing to be on the kicking team. He yelled at them, stopped the practice, said some choice bad words against, according to Gene. Stopped the practice, yelled at the players, and yelled at them that they weren't doing well. And a teammate mentioned that Mingo can kick because if you remember, I said a little earlier in the story that he kicked field goals for the Navy. So somebody in his team was like, hey, he knows how to kick. So coach's like, all right, let's see what you got. So he sent him down there with one of his other teammates to go and, switch positions and kick some field goals. He says that he kicked the first ball and it went through beautifully. It was high trajectory. It took off, went through. He moved back 10 yards, kicked another one through. He moved it over to another hash mark. This one went really off right. He says, this one wasn't great. And so the coach was turning around, saying, nah, whatever. You're not going to cut it. But this get to Gene. Gene is saying that something whispered in his ears that he had to get another chance, right? Beg the coach for another chance. So he said, listen, coach, give me another chance and I will make it happen. So that's what he did. The coach gave him a chance. He went back. That time, every time thereafter, he kicked the splits uprights, when you say uprights, just to make sure, right? That's kicking terminology. So Gene says that back then, kicker, like the quarterback, was a job reserved for white players, which is why, again, Gene is known as the first Black player to be a kicker in pro football, right? In professional football. And so, you know what? But the coach just wanted to win. He didn't care. He's like, whatever. He just wants to win games. So he had the team's trainer create a kicking shoe for him. And again, Gene became the first Black kicker in the AFL and later the NFL because, as I said, the leagues did form later. The next Black kicker to join the NFL professional football wasn't until 1985, okay? So even today, it's still not a position that if you look around, you see a lot of Black players play that position. And so there have only been, from looking up Gene's story, five Black kickers. Think about that. So, and some people don't know why. At this point, it's easy. It's 1960s. So in the 1960s, you could blame it on racism. And you could probably look at discrimination, but there's a lot of articles that were coming out, studies where a lot of Black athletes, when they're in high school and college, they don't want to be the kicker because they don't see it as super competitive. Again, these are not my words. I actually appreciate kickers. I'm just saying that it was a position that a lot of Black kids just didn't want to play, weren't into it, don't like it. They don't feel like it's competitive. And so that's just, or sometimes kickers are mocked. As we know, they're still mocked now, right? And so they're saying that could be part of it as well, not just because of, some discriminatory practices, but because there are some Black athletes that when they do go out for football, don't really see kicking as an ideal position. But anyway, I digress. Let's get back to Gene. So in September 9, 1960, the Broncos met the Boston Patriots. It's the AFL's first regular season, and it's the Broncos' first game. Their punt return and kickoff man got hurt, and so Mingo went in, running back kickoffs and punt returns. So he did both. He was doing kickoffs and punt returns. In the third quarter, Gene returned a punt for 76 yards down the sideline for a touchdown. The final score was 13 Denver, Boston 10. So it was exciting. They won their opening game, and it was an inaugural season. That day, Gene says his career was on an unusual path because after that, whenever one of his teammates got injured, Gene raised his hands and just volunteered. And that's how he ended up playing all these different positions, right? That's why he got halfback. There weren't a lot of players at that time. So he says he did halfback. He was a fullback. He was a wide receiver sometimes. Sometimes he played even defensive back. And then he ran back punt returns and kickoffs and all of that. At the end of the first AFL season, Gene Mingo was the league's leading scorer with 123 points. He was also the best kicker in the league with the highest field goal percentage. But as I've mentioned, this is the 1960s, so Mingo did face a lot of racism. Anytime he was named an All-Star, he didn't make the All-Star team. This is before, the Pro Bowl. And so he was named twice to All-Star, but never selected to actually play on the All-Star teams. And he says that he can't see any other reason why, but because he was a black player. So when Gene came back to the 1961 season, the Broncos had brought in 7 field goal kickers to replace him. And Gene was like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to teach him to kick. And so a teammate's like, what are you doing? Why they brought him in to replace you. Like, why are you doing this? And he said, listen, they got to outkick me. They got to be better than me. So until they can outkick me, then I'm going to teach them, right? So the way he saw it, he believed in himself, and he didn't think that these kids that came in now would take his job. He led the league in scoring again in 62 with 137 points. Again, wasn't selected to the All-Star team as some of his teammates. And people are saying, man, it's too bad how they treat you that way. But again, the way that Gene sees it is like, yeah, he knows why he wasn't selected, but he's just out there making his money and making his plays, right? So again, going back to some of his the points in some of his games. So again, 1960, the touchdown won the first. That touchdown won the first ever American Football League in the game, as I mentioned, his first game when they defeated the Boston Patriots. Mingo also scored the first points in the Mile High Stadium. At that time, it was called Bear Stadium with an 18-yard field goal. In the 1961 season opener at War Memorial Stadium against the Buffalo Bills, Mingo threw a touchdown pass from the halfback position to help the Broncos win 22-10. A 50-yarder to Lionel Taylor in the first quarter. Mingo kicked the PATs after each score. He led the American Football League scoring in his rookie season again and again in 1962 with 137 points. Mingo holds the Broncos franchise record for longest touchdown run, an 82-yarder against the Raiders in 1962. So I just wanted to give you some more perspective. During the 1964 season, after when he was married to his second wife at the time, he and his teammate were all partying, hanging out. At this time, there were curfews. So when you were on a team like this, they expect you to get back, on time. And they even did like bed checks, like the assistant coaches or whatever will come and make sure that you're in your room where you're supposed to be. So they were all partying. Then they realized they were running late. Supposedly, again, these women got the guys back to the hotel room speeding, right? They go up to a room and surprise, surprise, Gene says, and his teammate at the time, that no one invited these women up into the room. They were just there. I'm just telling you what was shared. And they were freaking out because the then assistant coach, Red Miller, were going to do bed checks. And so they were panicking. And so he hid these women in the closet. By the first pass, coach went away. But some other teammate must have seen these women. And so the coach comes back and he says that the coach came back and said, hey, I heard that you guys have 2 white women in your room. Again, 1960s, right? It's 1964. Gene and his other teammate were African American. And so, it's not just the idea of having 2 women in the room, it's 2 white women. And so they were told to report to the Broncos general manager's office the next morning, Dee Griffin. Gene begged. He said, listen, don't do this. You were at my wedding. I didn't do anything. Again, he's like, we didn't do anything with these women, we got rid of them, blah, 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 blah. Gene was like, I'll play whatever position you want, and I'll personally go and, beat the Oakland Raiders by myself, but there was nothing having it, again, it's 1960s, so he was cut from the team. after that, he had a kind of downward trajectory in his career. Never fully recovered. He played for Oakland. He played for Miami. Played for at the time the Washington Redskins. So something happened in a game against Philadelphia. He did a kickoff. He kicked off of a player, Timmy Brown, with the Philadelphia Eagles. He caught the kickoff and broke through the line of defense. He was the last guy there. Gina said, I was the last guy there, and I hit Timmy Brown from the front. And he said, at the same time I hit Timmy Brown from the front, he said Chris Hamburg, the teammate, was hitting him from the back. And he said it felt like he was basically like, he says, I feel like somebody had hit me in the middle of my head with an axe. So it was just, because remember, the players didn't have the type of equipment they have now. And so he said it felt like the back of his head got hit by an axe. He was laid out. He doesn't even know, like, he doesn't remember anything. He kept playing. They sent him back in after that hit. G went down. He jumped back up. Later, people told him that he played a brilliant game, that he was even shouting orders to the offense and defense from the sidelines. He doesn't remember doing any of that because obviously that man must have had a concussion, right? We know this now, but he doesn't even remember the game. People said, like, his teammate asked him a question, and he didn't even know where he was. He woke up in the hospital, and he's like, I got to go suit up and play. They had to show him a newspaper, show him that it's it was the following day. And so he said the headlines were reading, Mingo kicks time field goal, 35-35. And he says he doesn't even remember that. He doesn't remember that. From the concussions and the injuries, the Washington team released him. Supposedly, because he was playing too erratically. He was too injured, and so they let him go. He goes to the Steelers for one season, but again, they also let him go. Mingo retired in 1969 after realizing teams weren't going to sign him anymore, or as soon as they did, they would let him go. Because I guess after that really bad hit against Philadelphia with the concussion, he just, wasn't the same. He was getting injured. It was just, getting up, and it was just bad. So to deal with the pain after football, he said that there was a period of time where he took narcotics to numb the pain. He says that it wasn't out of pleasure, but it was out of simple pain because his body was so wrecked with pain. He had to go to narcotics to take care of it. Well, during this time period, he had a gun and accidentally discharged, and it hit his wife. He wound up in jail that night. And he says that he had like a spiritual awakening or something. His family visited. It was like a vision from God. And his wife at the time testified in favor of Gene. So because she didn't testify against him, they gave him probation instead of prison. He says from that day on, he never touched cocaine again. But he was given probation. And one of the requirements was to get a job. But again, as you know, as I've said previously, he didn't finish high school. He didn't get his GED. He went to the Navy, but he never finished schooling. And so he met with the doctor at a treatment facility because that's where the probation officer suggested he do. And the doctor asked him to become a counselor. And Gina's like, well, I don't even have my GED. And the head of the clinic is like, listen, I think this would be a good, something good for you. And so he went back to the place where he failed twice, but he earned his GED because now he had a purpose, a reason in his life outside of football to do something better and bigger. So he did. He earned his GED. Then he moved to get certification as a drug and alcohol counselor. He said that was the first time he felt like he can learn. He actually passed all those exams and everything to get him through the counseling. He didn't get anything below 95%. And he said for the first time he felt like he could learn because now he felt like he had a purpose. And so Gene went to work as a counselor for a decade. And he says that he helped families hold interventions. He says how he's now recognized often by those who thank him for that work versus the football field. And so that is the story of Gene Mingo. He's still alive today. The Broncos actually honored him in the Broncos Ring of Fame in 2014. He has an NFL record, most touchdowns passes by a halfback in a single game, which was 2, which I said a little earlier in this review. So he does feel some resentment towards the NFL, specifically the Washington Commanders at that back then, but because apparently they knew how bad his injuries were because the doctors then had the X-rays, and so he feels like they knew that his body was wrecked with pain and they never helped him. Because remember, and it wasn't just the Washington Commanders. We know that there are a lot of players from all these different eras of the 50s, 60s, 70s, even some 80s that were in desperate pain after football. And I know that this went long. I didn't expect this to be 25 minutes. But I read this article from a journalist who reached out to Gene Mingo because he believes that Gene Mingo should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and he's not. He can't be in the College Football Hall of Fame because he never went to college. And so this interviewer reached out to him and wanted to get his story out there. And so that's Gene Mingo. It was just a fascinating read, and I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about him and why some feel that he should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame because of his, not just his legacy, but obviously I just read statistics that, he put some points out there, So anyway, this is your episode of Diversity with Delilah. Have a nice day. I promise next week's won't be this long. Bye.
Yeah.